What if I told you that people living through the Great Depression, baby boomers who lived through economic booms most of us can only dream of, Gen X who grew up watching their parents struggle, Millennials who got hit with a recession right as they entered the workforce, and Gen Z who are entering adulthood during one of the most expensive periods in modern history, all made and are still making the exact same financial mistake. Different decades, different economies, different technology, different challenges entirely. And yet, generation after generation, the same single mistake keeps repeating itself, quietly wrecking financial futures that could have looked completely different. Today, we're going to break down exactly what this mistake is, why it keeps happening despite every generation swearing they've learned from the one before them, and most importantly, exactly how you can be the generation or the individual that finally breaks the cycle. This is a longer video than usual because this topic deserves it, so stay with me until the end, because the final section is where we actually turn this understanding into something you can use starting today. Let's start by naming the mistake directly, because once you see it clearly, you'll start noticing it everywhere. In your own life, in your parents' lives, in your grandparents' stories, and in the financial habits of people decades younger than you. The mistake is this: waiting for the right time to start building wealth, instead of starting with whatever you have right now in your current circumstances. It sounds almost too simple to be the explanation for something as widespread and persistent as generational financial struggle. But stay with me, because this single behavior pattern, dressed up in a different costume for every generation, is responsible for more lost wealth, more delayed retirements, and more financial stress than almost any other single factor you could name. Let's go back in time and actually trace this pattern through history, because seeing it play out across completely different economic environments makes it impossible to dismiss as just bad luck or unique circumstances. Start with the generation that lived through the Great Depression. These were people who watched banks collapse, who saw their parents lose everything almost overnight, who grew up in a world where financial security felt like an illusion that could vanish without warning. Understandably, this generation developed a deep, almost instinctual fear of financial risk. Many of them kept their money in cash, hidden away, distrustful of banks, and distrustful of the stock market entirely. Their logic made complete emotional sense, given what they'd lived through. But here's the mistake hidden inside that logic. They waited for the economy to feel safe enough before they were willing to invest and grow their money. And for many of them, that feeling of safety never fully arrived, even decades later, even after the economy had genuinely stabilized and recovered. As a result, an enormous amount of wealth that could have been built through decades of market growth simply sat in cash instead, quietly losing value to inflation year after year, because the right time to start investing kept feeling perpetually out of reach. Now move forward to the baby boomers, a generation that grew up during one of the strongest economic expansions in American history. Jobs were relatively abundant, pensions were common, higher education was significantly more affordable relative to income than it is today. On paper, this should have been the generation that built wealth effortlessly, and to be fair, many of them did. But a huge number of baby boomers made a different version of the exact same mistake. Instead of waiting out of fear, like the generation before them, many waited out of comfort and confidence. They assumed their pensions and Social Security would be enough, that homeownership alone would be sufficient wealth building, that there would always be time later to get serious about additional investing once their careers were more established, once their kids were older, once their mortgage was paid off. That later kept shifting further and further away, and by the time many of them reached their 50s and 60s, they realized their actual retirement savings, outside of their home and pension, was far smaller than they needed, forcing many to work years longer than they'd ever planned, or to dramatically scale back their expected retirement lifestyle. Then came Generation X, a smaller, often overlooked generation, sandwiched between two much larger ones. This generation watched their boomer parents work incredibly hard, sometimes losing jobs to corporate downsizing in the 80s and 90s, and developed a more skeptical, self-reliant attitude toward money. Many Gen Xers understood, at least intellectually, that they needed to save and invest for themselves rather than relying entirely on employer pensions, which were increasingly being phased out in favor of 401k-style accounts that required individual initiative to actually fund and manage. And yet, study after study has shown that Gen X, as a generation, remains significantly underprepared for retirement relative to what they'll actually need. Why? Because even though they understood the concept better than previous generations, many still fell into the exact same trap, just with a new excuse attached to it. I'll start contributing more once I get that promotion.
I'll start once the kids are through college. I'll start once we're finished paying off this debt.
Different excuses, same underlying pattern. The same waiting for conditions to feel more ready before actually beginning in earnest. Now let's talk about millennials, the generation that gets blamed constantly for financial struggles, often unfairly, given the unique economic circumstances they entered adulthood into. Many millennials graduated college directly into the 2008 financial crisis, facing a brutal job market, stagnant wages, and rapidly rising costs for housing and education. This generation has every legitimate reason to feel like the financial rules were stacked against them from the start, and in many measurable ways, they genuinely were. But even within this generation, facing real, documented structural challenges, the same core mistake still shows up, just wrapped in a completely understandable, sympathetic justification. I can't start investing until I pay off my student loans completely. I can't start saving until I'm earning what I actually deserve. I'll focus on building wealth once my financial situation feels more stable. And once again, that feeling of stability, that perfect moment to finally begin, kept receding further into the future for many people, even as small, imperfect starts made years earlier, despite imperfect circumstances, could have compounded significantly by the time they eventually did start. And now we arrive at Generation Z, the newest generation entering adulthood, watching everything that happened to the generations before them, having access to more financial information and education than any previous generation in human history, thanks to the internet, social media, and an explosion of financial content just like this video. You'd think, given all of this awareness, given all of this historical evidence showing exactly what mistake to avoid, that this generation would finally be the one to break the pattern. And yet, early data and countless personal accounts suggest the exact same core behavior showing up once again, just with an even newer set of justifications. The economy is too uncertain right now to start investing. Everything is so expensive that saving feels pointless. I'll start once I feel like I actually understand what I'm doing. Same mistake, different generation. Different specific words used to describe the exact same underlying hesitation. So here's the uncomfortable question this pattern forces us to confront. If this exact same mistake shows up across completely different economic environments, completely different levels of financial education, completely different historical circumstances, then maybe the explanation isn't really about economics at all. Maybe it's about something deeper, something psychological, something built into how human beings naturally think about uncertainty and the future. Let's dig into the psychology behind why this mistake is so universally tempting, regardless of generation, regardless of how much financial knowledge someone actually has. The first psychological factor is what researchers call present bias, our brain's natural tendency to prioritize immediate comfort and certainty over long-term, abstract benefits. When you're deciding whether to invest money today, the cost feels immediate and concrete. That's real money leaving your immediate spending power right now. The benefit, meanwhile, feels distant, abstract, and uncertain, some larger amount of money you might have decades from now. Our brains are simply wired to weigh immediate concrete costs more heavily than distant, abstract benefits, even when the math clearly favors the long-term choice. This bias doesn't disappear because you understand it intellectually. It has to be actively countered through habit and structure, which is exactly why simply knowing better has never been enough to solve this problem across any generation. The second psychological factor is the illusion of the perfect starting point. Human beings have a strong desire for things to feel orderly and controlled before taking action, especially with something as significant as their financial future. This creates a powerful, seductive belief that there's some ideal moment, some perfect combination of circumstances, income level, market conditions, and personal readiness that will make starting feel comfortable and risk-free. The problem is that this perfect moment essentially never arrives because life is inherently messy and circumstances are never fully ideal. There's always another reasonable-sounding reason to wait a little longer, and that reason always feels legitimate in the moment. which is exactly why it's so effective at delaying action indefinitely. The third psychological factor is loss aversion, our tendency to feel the pain of a potential loss more intensely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Starting to invest or save more aggressively often requires giving up something tangible right now, a bit of spending flexibility, some immediate comfort, in exchange for a benefit that only becomes real far in the future. This asymmetry, feeling losses more intensely than gains, makes the immediate sacrifice feel disproportionately painful compared to the abstract future reward, even when that future reward is mathematically much larger than what's being given up today. The fourth psychological factor, and this one is particularly relevant to why this pattern repeats across generations specifically, is social and generational storytelling. Each generation absorbs a specific narrative about money from the economic environment and cultural messaging they grow up surrounded by. These narratives feel like objective truth from the inside, even though they're really just one particular generation's understandable but ultimately limiting response to their specific circumstances. The Depression generation's narrative was built around scarcity and distrust. The Boomer narrative was built around traditional institutions providing security. Gen X built a narrative around self-reliance mixed with skepticism. Millennials built a narrative around systemic unfairness and delayed milestones. Each of these narratives contains real, legitimate truth about the circumstances that generation faced, but each one also, unintentionally, provided emotional cover for the exact same underlying delay, dressed up in generation-specific language that made the delay feel justified and reasonable rather than recognizing it as the same recurring pattern. Now, I want to be very clear about something important here, because this video isn't meant to dismiss or minimize the very real structural challenges different generations have genuinely faced. Rising education costs, stagnant wage growth relative to housing prices, job market instability. These are real, measurable, legitimate obstacles, not imagined excuses. This video isn't arguing that circumstances don't matter, or that everyone has had equal opportunity to build wealth regardless of when they were born. What this video is arguing is something more specific and, I'd argue, more useful. That regardless of how difficult or favorable someone's specific circumstances are, the mistake of waiting for those circumstances to feel perfect before starting is what consistently turns difficult circumstances into permanently missed opportunities across every single generation we've discussed. Let's actually look at what starting imperfectly, despite difficult circumstances, would have looked like across a few of these generations. Because the math here is honestly staggering, and it's exactly why this mistake deserves so much attention. Imagine someone during the Great Depression era who, despite understandable fear and genuine economic uncertainty, still managed to invest even a small amount consistently into the stock market starting in the mid-1930s, once the initial crisis had somewhat stabilized, rather than waiting decades for the fear to fully subside. Someone who started small, even amid real uncertainty, and stayed consistently invested through the following decades, would have captured one of the longest sustained periods of economic growth in American history. The difference between starting in the 30s versus waiting until the 50s or 60s, once things finally felt safe, represents multiple additional decades of compounding, an almost incalculable difference in final outcome. Now consider a millennial who graduated during the 2008 recession into a genuinely brutal job market. Someone who, despite that difficult starting point, managed to begin investing small amounts as early as possible, even alongside paying down student debt, rather than waiting to eliminate that debt completely first. Would today, over a decade later, have captured one of the strongest sustained bull markets in modern history. Someone who waited until their debt was fully eliminated before starting, which for many people took the better part of a decade, missed out on years of compounding growth during exactly the period when starting small would have mattered most. Precisely because time in the market, even with a smaller amount, tends to outweigh a larger amount invested later, once conditions finally feel comfortable. This is really the core insight underneath everything we've discussed today. The specific circumstances change generation to generation. The specific excuses change, dressed up in whatever language fits that particular era's economic reality. But the underlying pattern, waiting for permission from your circumstances before beginning, remains remarkably consistent and remarkably costly, no matter which generation is making the mistake. There's an additional layer to this pattern worth exploring before we move into solutions, because it explains why the mistake feels so invisible while it's actually happening. Every generation tends to judge its own financial caution against the specific disaster its parents or grandparents lived through, rather than against the actual opportunity cost of waiting. The Depression generation measured their caution against the trauma of total collapse, and by that standard, simply keeping their money safe felt like a clear victory, even though it quietly cost them decades of potential growth. Boomers measured their approach against the instability their own parents had experienced, and building a stable career with a pension felt like more than enough, even as it left many of them underprepared decades later. Each generation essentially graded its own financial behavior on a curve set by the previous generation's specific hardship, which made moderate, cautious inaction feel like genuine progress, even when it was quietly repeating the same underlying error in a new form. This generational grading system is part of why the pattern is so difficult to see from the inside, even for people who are otherwise financially literate and genuinely trying to make good decisions. When you're only comparing yourself to the fears and mistakes of the generation before you, doing better than they did on the surface can feel like enough, even if you're still falling into a version of the identical trap that has quietly limited every generation before your own. Breaking this cycle requires a different kind of comparison entirely, not comparing yourself to your parents' caution, but comparing your current behavior against the mathematical reality of what starting earlier, even imperfectly, would actually produce over time. It's also worth noting how modern life has added an entirely new twist to this old pattern. Previous generations had a limited number of narratives shaping their financial fears, whatever their own family and community experienced firsthand. Today, thanks to constant news coverage, endless social media commentary, and a non-stop stream of economic predictions and warnings, it's possible to feel like there's always a fresh, urgent reason circulating right now to wait just a little longer before starting. Every single week seems to bring some new headline about market volatility, economic uncertainty, or looming financial risk, and each one can feel like a legitimate, timely reason to delay. But if you zoom out and look across the decades, you'll notice something important. There has essentially never been a period in modern financial history without some prominent, widely discussed reason to feel uncertain about the timing. The specific headline changes constantly. The underlying function it serves, providing a fresh justification for the same old delay, stays exactly the same. This constant stream of new, urgent-sounding reasons to wait is precisely why building an automatic, consistent system matters so much more than trying to mentally overcome each new wave of uncertainty as it appears. You cannot outthink an endless supply of plausible-sounding reasons for caution, because there will always be another one waiting right behind the last one you managed to push past. The only reliable solution is removing the decision from that constant psychological battle entirely, through automation and consistent habit, which is exactly why this particular solution shows up as the common thread among the people across every generation who genuinely did manage to break free from this recurring pattern. So let's talk about how to actually break this cycle, because understanding a pattern that's repeated for nearly a century across completely different economic environments is only useful if it changes how you personally approach your own financial decisions starting today. The first shift is redefining what starting actually means. Most people imagine starting to build wealth as some large, significant action, a big lump sum invested all at once, a dramatic overhaul of their entire financial life. This image of what starting looks like is exactly what makes starting feel so intimidating and easy to postpone. Real starting, the kind that actually works across every generation we've discussed, looks almost embarrassingly small in the moment. It's setting aside $20 a week. It's opening an investment account with an amount that feels almost too small to matter. It's the size of the first step that makes it accessible, not the size of the eventual outcome. The second shift is separating the decision to start from the feeling of readiness. This is genuinely one of the most important mental shifts in this entire video, so let it sink in. You will likely never feel fully ready, fully confident, or fully certain that conditions are ideal for starting. That feeling of readiness, historically, across every generation we've examined today, essentially never arrives on its own. It has to be manufactured through the act of starting itself, through gaining experience, building confidence gradually, and watching small, consistent actions slowly compound into something real. Waiting for confidence before starting has the causality completely backwards. Confidence comes from starting, not the other way around. The third shift is building systems that don't depend on your motivation or your feelings about the economy on any given day. Every generation we discussed today had access to at least some tool for automatic, consistent saving or investing. Whether that was a simple bank account with automatic transfers, an employer retirement plan with automatic payroll deductions, or a modern investment app that can automatically invest small amounts on a regular schedule. The generations and the individuals within each generation who successfully avoided this trap almost universally relied on some form of automation, removing the need to actively decide again and again, month after month, whether conditions felt right enough to contribute. The fourth shift is consciously identifying your own generation's specific version of this excuse, because recognizing the pattern in the abstract across history is very different from recognizing it in your own real-time thinking. If you're currently telling yourself some version of, "I'll start once things feel more stable," pause and ask honestly whether that's a genuine specific plan with a concrete timeline, or whether it's simply the current generation's flavor of the exact same excuse that's been repeating for nearly 100 years across completely different economic conditions. The fifth shift, and this one requires real honesty, is accepting that starting imperfectly, amid real uncertainty and genuine difficulty, is not the same as being reckless or irresponsible. There's an important difference between ignoring genuinely urgent financial priorities, like high-interest debt or a completely absent emergency fund, and simply waiting indefinitely for some abstract feeling of economic or personal stability before beginning any form of long-term wealth building at all. Most of the historical examples we discussed today aren't cases of people ignoring genuine emergencies. They're cases of people delaying long-term wealth building far longer than their actual circumstances required, simply because waiting felt psychologically safer than starting. Here's something worth sitting with as we bring this together. Every single generation discussed in this video believed, at the time, that their specific circumstances were uniquely difficult, uniquely uncertain, uniquely deserving of caution before taking financial action. And in a very real sense, every generation was right. Their circumstances genuinely were difficult and uncertain in their own specific way. But history shows us something important hiding underneath that truth. Circumstances are always going to feel uncertain in every era, for every generation, because the future is inherently unknowable, no matter how stable or unstable any particular moment in history happens to feel from the inside. This means waiting for uncertainty to disappear before starting to build wealth isn't actually a strategy at all. It's a permanent postponement disguised as patience, because meaningful uncertainty about the future is simply a constant feature of being alive, not a temporary condition that eventually resolves itself into some perfectly stable, risk-free moment. The generations that managed to avoid this trap, at least partially, the individuals within each generation who broke from this pattern despite the surrounding cultural narrative telling them to wait, all shared one specific trait in common. They made peace with starting imperfectly, amid genuine uncertainty, rather than waiting for a certainty that history consistently shows never actually arrives, in any era, for any generation. So here's my direct challenge to you. Whichever generation you happen to belong to, whatever specific version of this excuse currently feels true and justified in your own life right now, what is the smallest possible version of starting that you could take today, this week, without needing to wait for your circumstances to feel more stable, more certain, or more ready? Not the big, intimidating version of starting that feels overwhelming and easy to postpone. The smallest, most accessible version, the $20, the small percentage of your paycheck, the single account opened today rather than someday. Because if the last 100 years of financial history have taught us anything clearly, it's this. The individuals and families who broke this generational cycle weren't the ones who waited for perfect circumstances. They were simply the ones who started small, started imperfectly, and started now, while everyone else around them was still waiting for a feeling of readiness that, across every single generation we've examined today, never actually arrived on its own. If this video helped you recognize your own version of this pattern, whether it's something you inherited from your parents, absorbed from your generation's collective story about money, or developed entirely on your own, hit that like button, share it with someone from a different generation in your life, a parent, a grandparent, a younger sibling, so they can see this pattern in their own experience too, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next video, where we'll break down exactly how to build the smallest possible starting system that actually sticks, regardless of how uncertain your current circumstances might feel. Because the mistake every generation repeats isn't about lacking money, lacking opportunity, or lacking intelligence. It's about waiting for a feeling that history proves over and over again, decade after decade, generation after generation, simply never comes on its own. See you in the next video. Until then, ask yourself honestly what you've been waiting for, and consider whether today might actually be exactly the right, imperfect moment to finally start.